Everyone this evening. My name is Jared Kinkley. I'm the founder and director for the Cooperative for Integral Ecology. And tonight, this session is sponsored by and facilitated by the Association of Pittsburgh Priests. For those who are not familiar, it's a diocesan-wide organization of ordained and non-ordained women and men who act on their baptismal call to be priests and prophets, with a mission that's rooted in the gospel and the spirit of Vatican II, to carry out a ministry of justice and renewal in ourselves and the church and the world. And our topic for this evening is integral ecology, the Vatican Observatory, Castel Gandolfo, New Dimensions in the Implementation of Laudato Si, with Dr. Christiana Zenner, who is Associate Professor of Theology and Science and Ethics and affiliated faculty in Environmental Studies at Fordham University.
Great. Thank you so much, Jared and Father John, and all the folks who have come together to do the important work behind the scenes that makes events like this go off seamlessly. Thank you also to everyone who has joined, whether in real time today, April 7th, or subsequently by watching this on one of the lovely channels and distribution networks. And thank you also to the Association for Pittsburgh Priests for your ongoing, long-standing commitment to conversation on matters of shared concern. Such fora continue to be important, and in polarizing civic times are a real gift and really important kind of space. So I'm honored to be part on many levels. Tonight, as Jared indicated, I'm going to be talking about integral ecology as the particular orienting concept through which we explore some of Catholic social teachings, more embodied and also multidisciplinary commitments. And the reason that this is titled the Vatican Observatory and Borgo Laudato Si as well is that on a research visit in May 2024, I had the privilege of visiting the Vatican Observatory, speaking with a couple of different folks there, and seeing the ground that was being broken for Borgo Laudato Si, which I'll talk more about. But the point of this talk is essentially to remind us of some of the main claims of Laudato Si and then its follow-up Laudate Deum. You probably won't need a ton of that. I'm guessing this group has rehearsed those abundantly, so this will be a shorter part of the talk. Then I'll talk a little bit about integral ecology and a book project that I've been working on and what arguments I'm making theologically with regard to integral ecology. And then we'll look at where integral ecology seems to be coming to life in terms of practical application on the ground, and then we'll open it up for conversation. Gratitudes we already did, but I repeat them exuberantly. Also, I want to recognize that in the complicated world that we inhabit, so much is facilitated by technology and by the internet and by, these wonderful devices that we have continued to hold, these strong computers that we have in our pockets, as well as the laptops and devices that allow us to connect everywhere. And I belabor this point because the ease of those networks is also built upon material resources and relationships of labor that are experienced as benevolent by us who are kind of at the top of this pyramid, but that also are predicated on modes of extraction and resource consumption, especially in an era of AI, that take very real tolls on human bodies and on water resources and a range of other things. So bringing to mindfulness the fact that technology is not neutral and that we try to use these things for good with mindfulness of the environmental impacts and the labor questions that are still very present with us, as I think Pope Francis would want us to consider. That being said, we're going to talk about Laudato Si and Laudate Deum. These are two documents that I did not know would be coming out when I started my gig as a professor. And this is probably not a surprise because one never really knows what a pope is going to do with encyclicals unless they're commemorating other encyclicals. But I was hired at Fordham in 2011. I had written a dissertation called Valuing Water, and that looked at fresh water from a range of lenses, including Catholic social teaching. It made the argument that in the Catholic Church's turn to ecological matters from both a theological lens and the lens of Catholic social teaching, those two things are not opposed, obviously, but the Catholic social teaching tradition is an explicit body of work in a distinctive way. I made the argument that in that ecological turn, fresh waters were a particularly potent and indicative site of reflection for how the Catholic Church was thinking about a range of matters. Central among some examples would be the Catholic Church's advocacy from the early 2000s that fresh water is a fundamental human right and even a right to life issue because it conditions the possibility of living a life with human dignity and has links to all sorts of human health. And indeed, as the church has said in multiple places, it is the right to water is fundamental to the achievement of all other rights. So I started thinking about this, doing scholarship on this, wrote a book, and Pope Francis had been, it was first published in 2014. Pope Francis had been elected and had signaled that he was interested in talking about creation and had, and problems of poverty. And he'd obviously taken the name Francis, which signified a number of things. But then lo and behold, 2015, he comes out with Laudato Si. So that was really exciting as a scholar because rare is it that an entirely new body of literature emerges that needs interpretation. And so, yes, I was ready. I was excited. And so the last 10 years have really been an immersion into Laudato Si in all kinds of ways. So I'll talk about some of that. Um, that then led to a second version, a revised version of my book, Just Water, that incorporated Pope Francis's updates and expansions of theological thought and Catholic social teaching on fresh water. And then, as you know, Laudate Deum came out in 2023, not an encyclical, it is an apostolic exhortation that is a follow-up to some of the key ideas in Laudato Si. And we'll talk about specifics of that later. But I'm guessing a lot of you have read this document. If you haven't, it is worth the read. Bear with me for a quick rundown of Laudato Si. An encyclical, as you know, is a document that has a very high teaching authority and dogmatic authority in the Catholic Church. This one is 6 chapters that are very wide-ranging, and Pope Francis strikes a hopeful tone in terms of human ability to respond to the interconnected social and environmental crises. So despite the fact that he says our common home is falling into disrepair, he emphasizes how the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor are interwoven. He also puts forward some constructive ideas about integral ecology, as well as ecological conversion, and related to that, ecological education. Laudate Deum of 2023 is an exhortation. It is much shorter, and I like to sum it up as a kind of postscript that says, "Excuse me, world, did you miss the message? Were you not listening to Laudato Si? Let me say it once more with feeling, but also with updates about what's happened in these last 8 years." So in that document, Pope Francis is much more explicit on the reality of climate change, the scientific evidence, the necessary actions, questions about efficacy at a range of levels of scale and political mechanisms, and then also questions about virtues and what is needed in order to bring the world back from the trajectory that he sees it being on. Um, I am going to go through each chapter a little bit because I think it helps us to understand why this piece of integral ecology is really important. Um, Chapter 1, it's addressed to absolutely everyone. This is new in the history of Catholic social teaching. Chapter 2, anyone can read it, but it is especially for Christians. and says something that I think is pretty radical. It recognizes that to the degree that Christian doctrine, and especially interpretations of Genesis, have led to a model of humans dominating the earth, Pope Francis says that's evidently a problem. We need to rethink our precepts and be aware that a more correct interpretation is a stance of stewardship. Now, I think this is pretty radical in a number of ways. Not because he's the first person to say it. He's not. Lots of people have said it. Protestant denominations, Catholic eco-theologians. He's not the first person to say it. John Paul II also said something similar. What he is saying, though, is that habitual interpretations of scripture that are now proven degrading need to be reassessed. And for a pope to say that in a document of this level of authority, to me, bespeaks a level of humility and of learning that I think is a very healthy model for all of us going forward. And it shows that the Catholic Church and theology are also dynamic, grounded by principles and history and a lot of other things, but also willing to respond to data from the sciences and social sciences. Chapter 3 touches on the technocratic paradigm and modern anthropocentrism. And this idea of the technocratic paradigm is essentially what I would colloquially call the unholy marriage of technology and economy, to assume that technological solutions or economic efficiencies, or those two things together, are going to solve the problems of social and ecological degradation. And Pope Francis says that's not the case. These things are only as good as the ethical frames in which they are put. So technology, yes, great. It's a proper power of human beings and invention, and all of that is great. But it can't just be expected to solve problems that we humans have also contributed to creating. So what is needed is an ethical frame. And it's in chapter 4, as well as differently chapter 5 and chapter 6, that Pope Francis gets into what some of those ethical frames might look like. Chapter 4 is on integral ecology, and he talks about environment, culture, and the common good, as well, oopsies, as well as justice between generations. Um, Chapter 5, he talks about how some of these things might look on different levels of scale. And he's constantly talking about dialogue in that chapter. And then chapter 6 is where he turns to ecological spirituality and especially ecological conversion. Now, I think that integral ecology and ecological conversion are very strongly linked because they are about ways of seeing, ways of turning to recognize the interdependence of all things. So in chapter 4, specifically on integral ecology, when I speak to audiences who are familiar with like environmental studies or environmental sciences or sustainability, they're like, oh yeah, ecology, no big deal. We got that. That's environmental science. And that's true. That's part of it. But most people are also really surprised to learn that that environmental science bit is only kind of one part of the integral ecology piece. So it's an important part. It's not going anywhere. There's also a typo on this slide. Environmental ecology is what that's supposed to say at the end of the first bullet point. But there are also all these other considerations that fit in. Because fundamentally, ecology is about relationships and realities, about the natural world and its modes of being degraded by economic and social forces, about relationships between humans on all types of levels of scale, and about relationships between humans and God. One of the reasons that I think ecological spirituality and conversion are linked to integral ecology is that there's this idea of observation and mindfulness and learning and change, or metanoia, which is the classical definition theologically of conversion, um, So this is paragraph 202 in Laudato Si. Many things have to change, but it is we human beings, above all, who need to change. We lack an awareness of our common origin, of our mutual belonging, and of a future to be shared with everyone. So this is a kind of conversion to awareness of our mutual embodiment, the ways that the waters, the air, the earth constitute us, and that we shape them, and the way that all of these dynamics also relate to the caliber of our ethical interactions with one another. So, I'll just pause on this slide for a moment. So, one of the things that as a scholar I found really fascinating when I read Laudato Si the first time, and oh my gosh, I have like many of you perhaps, like many professors, I have now read this document so many times that as one friend joked, Christiana, I love the document, but I might need to just Laudato cease for a while. I do love a good pun. Um, so I don't actually want to Laudato cease, but I do want to point out that one of the puzzles to me is that integral ecology is a very loosely developed notion in Laudato Si. And this is something that we can definitely talk about more fully. So there's a lot of promise in it. It's a really evocative phrase that people absolutely latch on to, myself included. But there are a bunch of things that Pope Francis does not do in chapter 4. So let's go back to what he does do. What he does do is on this slide. What he does not do is talk about other people or traditions that have talked about integral ecology. He doesn't compare it to any other kinds of notions that exist in the world or in spiritual traditions or in philosophy, though he does at other points talk about the importance of um, indigenous values. And we can talk about that too, if you'd like. That's a very important part of this document. And he doesn't really give a deep sense of where this notion is coming from for him. So after about 8 years of working on this document, I thought, you know what? I think it's time for me to write a book about the questions that I still have about this document and in the mode of a scholar to really delve in and say, what can I find out about and what can I theorize about what's going on here, both in terms of the inputs for the document and in terms of the impacts or the outputs. So, uh, quick advertisement. That book is going to be coming out in May 2026 from Fordham University Press, tentatively titled Beyond Laudato Si. But my editor tells me I need to get a more specific title, so I'm taking suggestions. One chapter, there will be chapters on Laudato Si and its impacts. How would we assess that? What do they look like? There's a chapter on theology and science before, in, and after Laudato Si. And there's chapters on a number of other things, including the puzzle of integral ecology. So, what I argue in that chapter is that I think the idea of integral ecology comes from two different streams in Catholic theology. One is the stream of integral human development and the way that Catholic social teaching, especially since, I'd say Populorum Progressio, like so the 1960s and subsequently, has been attuned to the fact, to its great credit, that economic development on its own is not sufficient to guarantee dignity and a robust quality of life and flourishing. And so that it needs to be girded by other kinds of goods and values. The other stream that I identify is the stream of human ecology, which was first articulated in a more robust way by John Paul II, taken up a little bit by Benedict XVI, and then really meant actually to be a core part of Laudato Si by Pope Francis. And we know this because Pope Francis said to then Cardinal Turkson, um, who was heading the um, Pontifical Council on Justice and Peace at the time. Now, the Vatican's been restructured, so it's a dicastery, which we'll talk about in a minute. But he said to Cardinal Turkson, let's get to work on a human ecology encyclical. And so, we can talk if you want in Q&A a little bit more about the history of the notion of human ecology and how that emerged in various papal teachings. But those are really the two theological streams that I see coming in and meeting in the idea of integral ecology. And so the chapter in my book makes that argument. But then there's also these practical questions of, well, what does integral ecology look like and mean in practice? And this is especially, I think, important and promising precisely because it is a term that so many people have latched onto. And so the open-endedness of the notion actually creates a lot of fertile possibility for how that might look. And I suspect that Jared and others here might have some thoughts on what the application or exploration of integral ecology looks like in particular contexts. In that sense, I think it's a notion that is very ripe for the application of certain forms of practical reason. That is, the application of kind of principles into the specificities of everyday moral reasoning and learning, but in a way that is ecologically attuned in very exciting ways. I also, and I write more about this in the book, I think there are a few dangers associated with the vagueness about what this term means, and I will be interested to see whether subsequent theologizing from the Vatican and from Pope Francis um, would articulate about that. But meanwhile, folks like me are having a field day thinking and working on it. Um, Even in the last 4 months, for example, I found out that there's a working group at Notre Dame that's meeting regularly on the idea of integral ecology. There are conferences that are springing up everywhere on it. I believe there was one at Marquette about a month ago. So people are really, really interested to think with this notion and how it can be brought to life. So for the next part of this talk, what I'd like to focus on are a few examples that I am seeing, especially as a result of my trip to the Castel Gandolfo and the Vatican Observatory last year, but also just at a kind of global scope more generally. And again, I welcome other examples and conversation about this. Okay. So, the first place where I started to notice that integral ecology was being invoked as a touchstone for specific Vatican-related projects was through the dicastery. This is a mouthful. The dicastery for promoting integral human development. It sounds better in Italian. Then again, what doesn't? So the dicastery is charged with promoting this idea of authentic or integral human development that I noted is one of the streams that has gone on, I think, to integral ecology. And under this overarching entity, which has some really wonderful people in its leadership, they've done a number of initiatives. One, of course, is to continue and promulgate the World Day of Prayer with the Prayer for Care of Creation. That is a day that is September 1st, 2020, any given year, but it started after Laudato Si was promulgated, and it builds upon and echoes and is in solidarity with the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew and ecumenical Orthodox churches that identified September 1st as the World Day of Prayer for the Care of Creation several decades ago. So that's also an interestingly ecumenical initiative. And we can talk about that as well, the ways in which ecumenical and to some degree interreligious connections function in these documents. Oops. The dicastery has also, in collaboration with a number of artists and other entities, put on some public-facing exhibits. So you can go, for example, to the you can go to the website for the dicastery. This is just a screenshot. And you can click on this. You can see, events, multimedia resources, what's going on. Again, this is pretty high level Vatican, but some of these events are also grounded in particular places, and especially St. Peter's Square, since that's the home of the Vatican. So when I was there in May of 2024, there was this exhibit that I was so excited to see because it was only there for a couple weeks. But it was a photo exhibit that drew on submissions from people all around the world about various intersections between the natural world, human communities, um, pollution, ecological improvement, water, climate change, urbanization. And you can even see some of these. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but we have an urbanization and an urban scene here. We've got water and various dynamics and looking very pure and glacial a little bit. We've got dust storms and kind of, and a possible evocation of pollution. We've got birds and marine water. And so I stopped short of including all of the pictures because there were many. But draped around the some of the columns in St. Peter's Colonnade were these amazing, huge scale pictures. And I love that you can see the people in the picture because it really gives a sense of it. Um, I'm also no expert on how many major art exhibitions or installations occur in St. Peter's Square, but I can't imagine there are very many. And one of the things that I have found really interesting since the release of Laudato Si is that the Vatican seems to be very inviting of or encouraging of visual art expressions and that kind of have an affective component to draw on people's awareness about social and ecological changes and perhaps this feeling of ecological conversion. So I think back, for example, to the week that Laudato Si was promulgated, and I think back to these images of I think it was about a 6-minute video that was broadcast into St. Peter's Square that had key words from Laudato Si and a range of images aligned in it. I still show this video to my students, and then that video was subsequently promulgated to all the bishops' conferences. This art exhibit didn't it wasn't just on the columns, it was also in St. Peter's Colonnade. And so you would walk in and you'd be in between the columns, and there's maybe, 20, 30 feet in between the two sets of columns, and you're on kind of a marble sidewalk kind of thing, protected by a roof. And then there were these large display boards with one giant picture on it and then an accompanying text from Laudato Si. And so it had a feeling very much of almost a Stations of the Cross, where you have a text and a moment to reflect on, you have an image to reflect on, and then you proceed to the next one. It was really, really interesting and neat to behold. This is also from the dicastery for promoting the promotion of integral human development. Um, as you can see, it was a 20-day, oopsies, I keep doing that. It was a 20-day exhibition curated by two sisters who founded something called the Emotions to Generate Change. So again, like the way that visual art can help connect human beings and visuality can help connect human beings to these realities that we may not always see in a direct way. How do you make the invisible visible? This is one way. And I think it's interesting that This exhibit happened in May 2024. Um, Laudate Deum was released in October 2023. And so the website suggests that, and I'm just reading here, um, these photographs as well make reference to Pope Francis's call in his apostolic exhortation, Laudate Deum. Yet with the passage of time, I have realized that our responses have not been adequate. While the world in which we live is collapsing and may be nearing the breaking point. In addition to this possibility, it is indubitable that the impact of climate change will increasingly prejudice the lives and families of many persons. We will feel its effects in the areas of healthcare, sources of employment, access to resources, housing, forced migrations, etc. And those are bold-faced by the dicastery. That's no edit from me. So from Rome in May, which I had never had a chance to be in Rome in May, and oh my goodness, what a special time. Um, the smell of jasmine is everywhere, and it really feels like spring and is lovely. From there, colleagues and I took a trip to Castel Gandolfo to meet with Father Gabriele Gianti, who is the associate director of the Vatican Observatory. Brother Guy Consolmagno is the director of the Vatican Observatory, and you've probably seen some of his many wonderful YouTube videos. He's a very energetic and thoughtful human. Father Gabriele is a cosmologist in the physics sense, not the theological sense. So he's a computational cosmologist who does all sorts of things that I have absolutely no comprehension of. But we talked about a range of things from the history of the Vatican Observatory and its import in communicating science and the compatibilities of theology and science. Um, to what that might look like in the present day and what the role of the Vatican Observatory is vis-a-vis Laudato Si, Laudate Deum, realities of interplanetary research that are ongoing, as well as the ecological realities on this earth. And so I don't have pictures of it. Unfortunately, I forgot to include them. But at the Vatican Observatory, they've been hosting a series of summer educational workshops as well as forums for researchers on topics related to Laudato Si. So water in our atmosphere, in our terrestrial experience, as well as the atmosphere, as well as questions of water interplanetarily, for example. So there's just a lot that is there, and I think it's a very, very interesting and rich time for thinking about theology and science, especially in light of Laudato Si. Okay, so then as we were being driven, oh, side note, um, for those of you who, like me, are super nerdy out there, I was also excited to learn that Father Gianti recently had an asteroid named after him. I think that news came out last fall sometime, and I was like, wow, I have never met anyone who's had an asteroid named after them. That is fantastic. So, so as he's, driving myself and colleagues around Castel Gandolfo, where the Vatican Observatory is located, I said, these gardens are beautiful. I mean, oh my gosh, is that a Roman ruin right over there? He said, oh, yes, 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 of course. The various emperors had summer residences here. Some of these ruins haven't really been touched. We just maintain them. So, as with many things in Rome, the sense of history is layered and present. And then we drove a little further and I looked over and I saw what is on the right of your screen, which is all of this orange the construction fencing. And so I said to Father Gianti, I said, you know, what is that? And he said, oh, well, that's for Borgo Laudato Si. And I said, what? Say more. Way to bury the lead. And he said, oh, no, this is a really big area. It's about 35 hectares, I think, where the Pope Francis has set aside this amount of land to build a demonstration farm and a living and learning center where people can come and take classes and do immersions. And details of it are still fuzzy for me. I am trying to find out more, but I don't have a ton of details yet. Um, but ground has been broken on it, and this is the example of it. So Borgo Laudato Si was then so this was last May that I found this out. It was formally announced, and let me advance the slide. Oops. Ah, where did it go? There we go. Um, it was formally announced, I think maybe about 6 months ago. And I'm sorry for the smallness of the font. Um, Borgo Laudato Si, it said, includes 55 hectares of extraterritorial area, divided into 30 hectares of magnificent gardens. Okay, well, that already exists at Castel Gandolfo. And 20 hectares of agricultural and farming land, greenhouses and service buildings that the Borgo is committed to preserving and developing with loving care, by also adding to the investment on education the essential commitment to foster the culture of care. Um, so there are, in addition to already working areas of what this website calls pontifical farms, it's going to be based on a circular economy model. And so this is what the text down low says. Employing a model of circular economy that's based on sharing, reuse, repairing, reconditioning, and recycling, as well as the creation of an energy community based on renewable resources. Biodiversity preservation is centralized. And they say the main thrust of Borgo Laudato Si is education in integral ecology and fraternity, in line with Fratelli Tutti, the subsequent encyclical from 2020, making it inclusive and accessible to everyone, especially to vulnerable people. From job training to educational courses and so forth, it's an opportunity to take advantage of the themes of the encyclical Laudato Si. And so the attention of the Vatican is that for this Jubilee year and a time when many people are making pilgrimages to Rome and surrounding areas, this would be a chance to really begin showcasing this initiative. Um, I got these a little out of order. Sorry about that. Um, so what does this look like? To sum up, what can integral ecology look like? Some models from the Vatican. Non-exhaustive, but always interested to see what they're doing at the top. Exhibits on integral ecology and ecological conversion. Visuality, films, the affective connection that helps us understand the ways in which we belong to the world and the world to us. And that is a matter of theological connection as well. There's also the Laudato Si action plan for institutions, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then, as I have just described, at Castel Gandolfo, there's the Vatican Observatory and the ongoing mission of promoting the relationship between science and theology. And then there's this Borgo Laudato Si in development, which is the Integral Ecology Living and Learning Center. So what is the Laudato Si action platform? Once again, this is sponsored by the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, and it's actually one of the earliest things that the Dicastery did to push forward some of the ideas in Laudato Si. So the idea behind it is that the Dicastery, through this platform, offers resources for helping different communities to think through how they might live out Laudato Si's commitments in their particular locations and institutional contexts. And that includes levels of individual action, but it also includes possibilities for restructuring in systemic ways. This is voluntary, of course. It has been taken up in some ways by some institutions and not at all by others. Personally, as a professor employed at a Jesuit university, it's been interesting to see which Jesuit universities are keen to pursue these conversations and think through this action plan with regard not just to course offerings or urban gardens, but also to things like physical plants and, energy use and sources. And are there possibilities for water reuse and a range of other things? So I think there's a lot of possible growth that can happen here. And we can talk about that if you like. Oops. Okay. But another thing that I want to talk about is, and this is not on the Vatican driven angle, but it is something that flows from the Laudato Si action plan and connects to the ideas of Laudato Si, is something called the Bethany Land Institute in Bombo, Uganda. And the Bethany Land Institute is a model of residential, agricultural, and economic education that is premised on ideas of integral ecology and also works with the Laudato Si action platform to try to pursue what the seven goals of Laudato Si, which um, we can talk through if you're interested. What's really fascinating as well about the Bethany Land Institute is that it is geared toward not just theological education, but also practical land-based education, reforestation, um, the care of waterways, sustainable crops that are climate specific, circular economies, and small-scale economic exchanges. And I was giving a talk at a university outside of Chicago recently and met with someone who's been very involved with and is on the board of the Bethany Land Institute. And she spoke about the power of over several years seeing tree planting efforts. They plant the trees begin to grow. Things take time, right? It's not the gratification of like election cycles or fiscal quarters. This is organic time, which is different. But she said that over the course of 2 to 3 years, after some of these plantings, a spring that had dried up in the region popped up back through the earth and started to flow. And I mean, when she told me, it gave me chills. When I told you just now, it gave me chills. But the possibilities of regenerative nurturing over time are really being embodied in endeavors like this. And it's deeply, deeply heartening to see. The Bethany Land Institute is indebted largely also to the vision of a professor and Ugandan named Emmanuel Katongole, who is also part of the integral ecology, really the force behind the integral ecology working group that I noted earlier at Notre Dame. For those of you who might be thinking, well, that all sounds great, but I don't have 50 hectares to dedicate to establishing my own Borgo Laudato Si or Bethany Land Institute, you might consider taking a look at the Laudato Si movement if you're not already familiar with it. This is a movement that is adjacent to and works with the dicastery, but is also independent and lay run. And it is a global enterprise that is really focused on ecological education and spirituality. They've got a lot of interesting projects and, a lot of connections to prayer life, advocacy for seasons of creation, and a range of other things. And this organization grew out of something called the Global Catholic Climate Movement. That was founded, I think, even before Laudato Si. And then after Laudato Si, they thought, wait a minute, let's reconsolidate around a bigger vision. And so the goal of the Laudato Si movement is to, as they say, help the world's 1.3 billion Catholics bring Laudato Si to life and save God's creation. And how that looks takes a different shape in different contexts. Definitely worth looking into as well. So I am also aware that in our midst, we have Jared Kinkley and the Cooperative for Integral Ecology. We have many of you from many places around the US, certainly. I saw Washington, certainly Pittsburgh, someone from Maine, looked like someone was from Florida or at least someplace that was really sunny. I don't know, California. So I'd love to hear whether and how there are initiatives that you're connecting to as well in your thinking about integral ecology. And so I just wanted to conclude with a few words for our time that are from Pope Francis. First is the reminder that every ecological approach needs to incorporate a social perspective that takes into account the fundamental rights of the poor and underprivileged. And I think it goes without saying, but in this political time in the US, I will say it. This is an especially urgent reminder for our time. Um, then also, I love this phrase. This is a mantra for researchers everywhere in Laudato Si, number 140, paragraph 140. Um, it's essential to give researchers their due role, to facilitate their interaction, and to ensure broad academic freedom. Also, something very important as we see a moment when universities and research institutions more generally are really struggling with what funding and collaboration will look like as there are major, major changes underfoot in the United States. Um, and then, concluding with Laudate Deum, the reflection and information that we can gather from these past 8 years, again, this is written in 2023, allow us to clarify and complete what we were able to state some time ago. The situation is now even more pressing. Um, and, I think one of the things that spiritually, both the realities of our world and these documents taken over time invite us to reflect on is where to find that motivational, spiritual nexus of contentment and delight that allows us to imagine flourishing creatively and inclusively without burnout or other forms of um, succumbing to a kind of negativity that is all too prevalent. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you, Christiana, for sharing those rich reflections and allowing us to absorb that information and sit with it as you shared it. There's a lot of richness there that we can spend time unpacking. As you said, you've read Laudato Si how many times over, and there's always some nugget to pull out there. One of the pieces that jumped out to me, particularly while you were mentioning the Bethany Land Institute, was that importance of literally getting our hands dirty,
Yes.
not just staying in our silos, not staying inside our homes, but literally putting our hands in the dirt or touching the hands of someone who's hurting, getting out there and doing that theology on our feet piece, right? Um, and to your point about the integral ecology piece being something that's being unpacked still, I think about the expansiveness of it and
Mhm.
how it is so broad and how that is liberating in some sense. But then I think you use the word laudato cease as well, how that can also be shell shocking, like, oh man, where do I go from here? So one of the questions I think I saw come up in the chat and I found myself constantly returning to is, okay, what does this mean in our context? How do I go from the broad to the particular?
Mhm.
Maybe you've encountered that in your classes that you've taught or in other lectures, but maybe there's a nugget of wisdom you could draw out for us in response to that.
Oh, absolutely. That is an amazing and super important point. And yeah, the question that I so often get from undergraduates is, okay, this is great. So what do we do? Like, yeah, I'm on board. That's cool. So what? Um, and I think that it can be intimidating, as you suggested, to know where to begin when there are so many abstractions or so many needs. So for me, the way I tend to say it as someone who's keenly attuned to fresh water
Mm,
is that for me, my vector is fresh water, right? Like, so if you're either not sure where to begin or you really love fresh water, which everyone should because we really definitely need it, um, find out where your fresh water comes from. Trace your watershed, trace its journey, learn about your sanitation systems and projects, learn about advocacy in your community, learn about, are there lead pipes that need to be replaced? That's one example. So learn your watershed and learn the infrastructure, and then think about how those things intersect and whether there's a way that you can jump in. But that's just one example. So the take home method is really find your vector. And that will be different for everyone. You mentioned literally getting your hands dirty. For some people, that's gardening. And then that can link into thinking about food systems and food sheds. And that can lead into thinking about corporate agriculture and animal feeding operations and all those kinds of things. And so, find your vector and just keep following it and kind of, pulling on that thread on the tapestry. Not that you need to unravel the tapestry, just that you need to see a little bit behind the picture as to how all these threads tie together. Um, I'm also seeing this excellent question from Luann in Gaithersburg. Please discuss capitalism and corporatism and also militarism and war and their effects on integral ecology. Hmm. Yes, hugely important. Um, Militarism and war. In all discussions of fossil fuel use and climate change at national levels, one thing is never mentioned, and that is the military and its role in emissions. Um, so that is a big missing piece of the puzzle. We are not in a political moment where any of those conversations are going to be taken seriously on Capitol Hill right now, I think. But it is indubitable that militarization is dramatically linked to climate change in terms of fossil fuel emissions, and also weaponization and production of all sorts of weapons, as well as their deployment, and the massive, massive environmental and social effects of warfare are just stunning. I think that, pointing, of course, to the Ukraine right now is one example, but especially pointing to Gaza and the destruction of innocent human lives there as Israel searches for Hamas, as well as the total devastation of infrastructure, the lack of fresh water supply, and the way that water is being weaponized in that part of the world. It is really, those all are examples of violations of integral ecology.
Mhm.
I would also argue that the weaponization of water, for example, as a key part of water being a key part of integral ecology, the weaponization of water is not only based on physical violence that is direct and linked to war, but it is also the result of governmental and economic and corporate and community decisions that often prioritize profit or short-term returns over long-term community health. And so, for example, in 2014, 2015, 2016, the Flint water crisis and how the diversion or sorry, the change in water source to the Flint River for the city of Flint, which had a lot of chemicals in it, led to the corrosion of pipes going into people's homes, which led to lead being released, lead, the chemical PB, being released, which led, in the sense of caused, um, major rashes and ailments and long term neurological damage to many young inhabitants of that city. So the ways that water can be life-giving are many. The ways that it can be a violation or even weaponized, consciously or not, are also very many. And thinking about integral ecology, I think, relies us to get into a lot of those relationships that can too often be invisible to communities of privilege, at least.
What you're sharing there, Christiana, that jumps out to me. I think it was in your book you also spoke about the presence of pharmaceuticals in our water,
Yes.
and that
Hmm.
diffuse impact that these decisions can
Yep.
make on one and ultimately affects all, right? There's that connection between environmental and person too, right? Are that
Definitely.
all connected? um, on that war piece, we can talk back to Louis LeBray, right? Dominican preacher who's, started to percolate on integral human development and bring that forth into our current conversation and all that. One of the questions that I saw here that really jumped out to me as I think is a common frustration for many of us in this space is, hey, this has been around for 10 years, Laudato Si, that is, and we're not hearing it from the pulpit. We're not getting
Yeah.
that buy-in from our pastors or from the folks in charge there. And perhaps this is just a question for us to reflect on a bit is what is that invitation? As you mentioned, what is our slice of the pie? And how can we poke and prod the
Hmm.
as it is now? Perhaps, you mentioned your entry point specifically being water.
Hmm.
Can you recall for us, maybe an initial or a formative poke or prod that you got in response that moved you in this direction?
Oh gosh. I mean, I don't know how much of my biography you want me to get into here, but I'm kidding. Um, so I was born in the Central Valley of California. And the Central Valley, for those of you who may not know, is one of the agriculturally productive regions of the United States from which a lot of vegetables, almonds, fruits, etc. comes. And I have early memories of being aware of water in multiple ways. And then my family moved to Colorado, where there was a lot of aridity as well. And over time, I became very aware that there was a social norm that everyone should have lawns, but there were often also droughts. And so there were watering restrictions on the lawns. And I just thought, why? What is going on here? This is all of this a given? Um, so those kind of early watchings of Western water and the way that physical scarcity of something, in my case, water, for other people, it might be food or other kinds of goods, um, awareness of scarcity puts that vital
Mhm.
entity into stark relief. And then I went to graduate school thinking that I was going to do doctoral work in bioethics because that's what I had been working on. And that's where my interest in Catholic moral traditions had emerged. And I just realized one day, as I was thinking about my coursework, but also reading about water for no courses whatsoever, just for my own personal interest, I was like, wait a minute. The questions surrounding fresh water, how societies value it, how we distribute it, what kind of thing it's understood to be, who gets to define it, who gets to control it, these are all ethical questions. And so our knowledge of what water is and our commitment to that form of epistemology, to that form of knowledge, dictates what kind of futures waters have and what kinds of futures people dependent on those waters have. And if that's not a matter for ethics, then I don't know what is. So my dissertation, I brought this idea to my dissertation advisor, and to her enormous credit, she said to me, I don't see what you see yet, but I trust that you will make it clear to me. So go
Mhm.
and do that. And I mean, that still gives me chills every time I think about it because the trust in younger generations or in any of us, regardless of age, to come from a particular perspective and to be able to say, you know what, there's something here. And I don't fully know how to articulate it yet. I mean, me talking about younger me sounds very like educated and clear, but of course it was very murky at the time. Hindsight's 2020. But that trust, from a mentor, from a boss, from an educator, from, anyone to say, I don't know, like, figure it out. Let's talk it through is a really important way of dimensionalizing things that we take to be obvious. And for
Mhm.
me, that's part of what integral ecology is about. It's fundamentally interdisciplinary. But it's also part of why I think ecological conversion is linked, because it's about ways of seeing and these constant dynamic processes of
Mhm.
moving towards fuller forms of recognition and adjusting course when we're a little off or had a misapprehension. We all get things wrong all the time. So then we try to do better. We
Mhm.
try to be, more capacious in our understanding.
Mhm.
And I think that like that the dynamism of that invitation is, I think, why I like pairing ecological conversion with integral ecology, because it's not something that stays still. It's something that says, okay, well, here's how it looks right now. Let's keep turning this soil and see what happens.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's that movement of it that continue. I think it's in Francis's newest encyclical, Dilexit Nos, he talks about discernment, and I
Mhm.
think that is quite illuminating when you talk about identifying your vector. It's a reality that exists that we just need to uncover and spend that time with. And I think one of the pieces I saw mentioned over here was also the reality and the importance of community in that
Yes,
decision making and holding each
definitely.
other to account in that. Is there can you think of, you mentioned the Bethany Land Project or Institute. Um, what are some other examples that you've seen of like localized people doing the work of Laudato Si or doing work that's inspired?
Yeah. Well, I this is something that I just would love to ask you all to keep your eyes on, because I think one of the cool things about this notion and its open-endedness is that these places don't have to be Catholic, right?
Hmm.
Like there are people and institutions and farms and communities that are embodying principles of regeneration and circular economy and non-domination
Hmm.
and flourishing for the poor, as well as sufficient food, local food supplies and clean water. And people are working on those everywhere. Like we don't see stories of those all the time in the news because we all know that the news,
Hmm.
what's clickbait, right? But there are an increasing number of intentional economic and community-oriented um, living models that are going on around the world, which are totally worth looking into. I even thinking, gosh, this was, oh, I think there was a spate of articles in some national news like maybe 3 years ago, still kind of in the throes of the pandemic, that
Hmm.
talked about adults opting to buy property and cohabitate as a community
Hmm.
instead of kind of individualized apartments, and like what that would mean and how they would share space and where they would get their food and could they grow a garden, and like those are examples of it
Hmm.
too. Um, Another example that again is not formally inspired by Laudato Si but has a lot of interesting connections to it is Soul Fire Farm, which is in New York, which was created by a woman named Leah Penniman, who is just a really amazing human being and very spiritually connected to Black African traditions. And a lot of what she sees in her work is the importance of land as a site of healing, not just rehabilitation of the land, but as a site of healing from the pains of colonization and slavery and lack of economic and property opportunities for especially Black Americans. And so thinking about the ways in which attunement to land and healthy living in community can be forms of healing
Hmm.
for historical traumas as well as ongoing global problems is also really neat. So I think while we're in an early phase of what are the places inspired by Laudato Si, I think it's also equally interesting to think about what are movements and examples of places that seem to resonate with Laudato Si.
Hmm.
To that end, I saw a comment go by earlier about how um, it might be interesting to do a reading group or conversation group with Protestant churches in the Pittsburgh area. That seems like a great idea. Because honestly, and this is there's a whole thing about this in my book as well. Um, a lot of Protestant congregations got to creation care and the social ethics angle well before the Catholic Church did. So they have a lot to teach and reflect on and talk about as well from their situated perspectives. Like the Lutherans have been doing this kind of thing for a while, and then there's a whole lot of Protestant congregations. The Lutherans, again, are just an easy example that have published formal engagements with and responses to Laudato Si. So then, like, if you read Laudato Si and read the responses to it and talk about what's going on between those and in your communities, would be fantastic.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, I was at a summit with Tree Pittsburgh and a few other faith denominations that we had about engaging faith communities in this type of work. And there's a gentleman there, Presbyterian pastor John Creasy is his name. He part-time works at Garfield Community Urban Farm over in the neighborhood of Garfield for people who are in Pittsburgh are familiar. And he also has started an initiative that the name is escaping me at the moment, so I apologize. I'll look it up and I'll put it in the chat, where he walks with faith communities and helps them unpack what makes sense for them in their particular context
Awesome.
of co-creation, right? Specifically in ecology, in nature sense of things. So there are a number of neat organizations that folks are popping into the chat over here as well. So please check that out. Sister Barb, I see you have your hand up over there. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to share that I very often reflect upon creation as having rights as we, as humans, proclaim that we have rights, and to see how we can cooperate together, creation and humanity, for equity.
Mm,
And I'm very involved in trying to transform. It's a dirty word, DEI, but it is that diversity of creation with humanity working together for equity.
Oh,
mm,
that is awesome. Sister Barbara, I would love to be in further touch about your efforts because that is so important. Thank you so much for saying that. And this also reminds me that I can't believe I haven't said this yet because usually I say this way earlier in conversations. Um, Communities of women religious have been doing this work for decades, and they didn't get cited in Laudato Si or Laudate Deum, but they have been doing this work understanding the intersections of ecology, social well-being, and stewardship. And so the ways that various congregations of women religious have been stewarding their lands, whether as marshlands or farmlands, thinking about community justice, thinking about food access, thinking about education, thinking about gardening. The Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph, up here in the New York area, I think has had a ban on plastic water bottles in their congregation for like 8 years or something. A number of sisters organizations are members of Blue communities. Oh, someone just put that. Loretta from Ontario. Oh, hi. My boyfriend's in Ontario. Um, so yeah, I mean the ways in which I think the sisters have been showing the way forward since before Laudato Si is really, really significant. And so that, again, like places to look for integral ecology that may have predated Laudato Si, look to the sisters.
mm. Amen to that. Yeah, we have the Sisters of St. Joseph here in Baden, just north of Pittsburgh, who have 80 acres that they're looking to intentionally reclaim and transform, and they've got a
Wow.
community gardens associated with that. You mentioned intentional living communities. Many on this call are familiar with the Sisters of Divine Providence at La Roche University, have recently granted some of their land for an eco-village initiative that is very
Oh,
much what you described. Um,
amazing.
so there are some really neat pieces out there. And for folks who are seeing the chat, just scroll right by.
Yeah,
Jim wanted me to let you know that he will be capturing this and we will send it out with the recording after the fact. So you don't.
beautiful. Thank you. I'm also seeing from Luann the question about meat eating and ecology. Yeah. Okay. So on the level of so one of the things that is tricky about these conversations is you've got personal levels, you've got the institutions with which we interact and have influence on every day, me as an educator, the classroom, advocacy, I can do at Fordham, that sort of thing, voting, community, what we teach our kids, all these things, and then all the way up to bigger levels. One of the things that Pope Francis does not talk enough about in Laudato Si, and that he should have, honestly, is not just agriculture, which he does name, but meat consumptive diets in particular. And so this is a much longer conversation. It's also linked to the water conversation, but animal agriculture is very water and resource intensive, at least in how it's done in the United States and confined animal feeding operations. And it's also pretty inhumane in a lot of iterations and rough on the animals. So from an animal ethics perspective, it's also troubling. So in terms of actually reducing one's energy and water footprint on the planet, eating a reduced meat or vegetarian diet has a lot of impact. And when amplified by other people doing it, can also have a lot of impact. Now, yes, we need to be careful not to have things flown in from super far away, that would counteract some of the winds. But if you look at water footprint calculators online, for example, you'll see, or what's the virtual water content of something like a hamburger, or your jeans, or a range of other things. I know you don't eat jeans. I hope you don't eat jeans, as in blue jeans. But so we'll just keep it to food. But in imagining the water inputs to different products, and especially in this case, meat, can have a real impact. So I have over time definitely dialed down my meat eating, and I don't eat very much meat. When I do, I try to make it local. But I'm also kind of an American, so I do from time to time really, really appreciate meat. And this is a growing edge for me because I know it's one of the things that I can do that both cultivates mindfulness and has an impact.
Thank you for that, Christiana. Thank you for the question there about the meat eating and ecology piece.
Yeah, yeah. And I see Gina's point, better to buy slow-grown animals direct from the farmer. Absolutely.
Mhm.
And it seems like there are probably a lot of farms near you guys, given where you are. So that's a fantastic option.
Mhm. I think saw Minette. Did you have a question you wanted to offer?
Mute.
There you
Hi,
go.
I was so struck by the description of the planting of the trees and then the water coming back. And I'm wondering, and then connecting that in with this notion that of the material and the spiritual kind of coming together. I know this is discussed in your book as well, the Just Water, which is great. I'll
Oh,
put a plug
thank
for
you.
her old book. But I wonder if you could just talk with us about how that is all connected. So as I was thinking about the like the water coming back from planting of the trees, what do we know about that? Is that an isolated incident or
No,
is
it's
that
it's that's a great question. No, it's really not an isolated incident. So there's a really strong relationship between tree presence, soil integrity, and water flows. And they all mutually reinforce one another. And then when one starts disappearing, or if a hillside is cleared, a lot of the soil, which was bound by the root structures previously, and other kind of energetic organisms in the soil, the that soil becomes loosened and dried out, and then when rains come, it just gets washed away. And then the patterns of soil moisture and other kinds of water flows are interrupted and fundamentally changed. So, Wangari Maathai is now deceased, but a Nobel Peace Prize winner from Kenya who was responsible for the Greenbelt movement. And her big insight is that if you empower women to plant trees, many positive outcomes emerge for the women, and because of the trees and the soil and the water. And so there is a really not known interconnection among these things. So that's a form of integral ecology on a smaller scale that really does matter.
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
is so neat. And if
Yeah,
I
isn't
can
it
ask
neat?
a follow-up.
Yeah.
So one of the things, so recently, I needed to research what hot water heater I needed to replace mine with. So I did the little analysis and I've determined that by moving over from my gas hot water heater to a hybrid model, that it will save enough carbon per year that that's like the equivalent of planting 50 trees a year, which
Awesome.
is really, I think, an interesting way to think about it. And I'm just wondering, like, do you have any metrics around water that we could, like, what does that mean then if it's like as if you planted 50 trees a year? What does it have an impact on water then too? I don't know. I just was thinking of that as you were speaking about the water coming back because of the trees.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on where you are and what your watershed and your water situation look like. So, for example, if you're in Southern California, you're going to
Mhm.
be legally required to use low flow shower heads and toilets. Um, Also, I just really appreciate being able to give a theology talk and bring up toilets. Um, but it's, th these things are differently incentivized or regulated depending on where you are. So, I think that the specific impacts of specific consumer and infrastructure products vary depending on where you are. But what I like to say is that regardless of where you are, thinking about those connections and trying to find out what you can about the inputs and the impacts has the habit of cultivating patterns of mindfulness and attention. And those patterns and habits of mindfulness and attention, I think, are virtuous, because what is a virtue, according to Aristotle and Aquinas, other than a good habit repeatedly done. And so those habits of thought can be virtuous, but also importantly, and this is a huge part, I think, of their virtue, is can open us up to seeing connections where we are not used to seeing them before and asking questions about what is invisible to us, but that may be nonetheless part of the products we consume and the lives we live and the way we structure our days.
I have to jump in here for a moment. We're coming up on the end of our time, but thank you so much, Minette, for bringing that piece out for us as well and drawing that out. I think some of us may be familiar with the Yellowstone story of what happened when they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone. The trees came back, the elk were fewer, and the rivers literally moved because of one species being reintroduced. But I did want to put in one more question here that we had closer to the top that we have kind of danced around a little bit that I think might be helpful for some folks. It was from Anita earlier on. And this will be our final question before we wrap up is speaking about the effects of waste to air, water, and soil, how can we bring awareness about the inadequate disposal of waste and how it was negatively affects its negative effects on integral ecology? We kind of talked about that a little bit during your presentation of the circularity of things, but what are the negative impacts of that waste on an integral ecology? What does that?
Oh gosh. Yeah, such a great question. And I mean, we could spend another entire session talking about waste and discards and effluents because there are so many ways to parse what waste is, right? So a lot of us think of it, and rightly so, as sanitation, what goes into the toilet and that sort of thing, or what goes down the drain or the disposal or the trash compactor or, out into the trash bin. Um, I think here too, it's really helpful to break it down into kind of systems. And so for me, I think about sanitation, which is intimately linked to fresh water supply because you need the two to be separate or everyone's going to be sick. And we have that advantage in many places in the United States. But one of the fascinating and very dumb things about, I mean, it's for good reason, but it's now dumb, is that we have often drinking level quality water in our toilets. And, we can use that for watering plants and so forth. But why, we need to think about multiple types of water systems, not just like one in, one out. So that would help with thinking about waste in a more circular way from a sanitation perspective. Also, composting toilets, all of those kinds of things. Lot we can do in terms of, effluent
Mhm.
on domestic levels. Um, I think that where Pope Francis would probably go with the waste question, though, is not to the question of toilets, alas. Um, I think he would probably go to the question of overconsumption. And he has spoken in a number of settings about excessive food waste, which a number of different groups and dioceses that I've spoken with are really interested in addressing, both in terms of eating less meat, but also in terms of limiting the amount of food that is wasted. Um, but then also just this question of overconsumption in a capitalist, rapid fire producing consumptive economy more generally. Now, granted, if we are careening headfirst into a recession, people are probably going to curb some habits of consumption for non-essential goods. But we also live in a culture that very much incentivizes disposability. And so, what would it mean to think about reusability and longevity and legacy instead of disposability? And I talk about this with students in terms of bottled water in single-serving disposable plastic water bottles. But, we can think about that in a lot of frames more generally.
Mhm.
In terms of agriculture and manufacturing, thinking about pollution and the kinds of chemicals, whether that's atrazine or other insecticide, pesticide, fertilizers, um, and non-point pollution into watersheds, or whether it's pollution from manufacturing processes. Like there is so much that needs to be addressed. And one of the problems is that in most cases, and certainly it looks like under the EPA in this current presidential administration, the polluter tends not to have to pay. So the effects of excess polluting waste go downstream to the most vulnerable human and ecological populations. And that really needs to be addressed, but I haven't yet figured out. I tell my students all the time, like, you want to work on ecological problems, work on integrating the cost of externalities into
Mhm.
various forms of agricultural and manufacturing behavior,
Mhm.
because that would change a lot. It would
Mhm.
change a lot.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Christiana. And thank you so much. We are so grateful for you spending the time with us. If you all are on here and you want to hit the react button, maybe give us some hearts, a round of applause if you appreciated the time together. Uh,
Thank you.
we certainly did. So thank you for that. Thank you.
I really appreciate this. And thank you all for the amazing questions and engagement. Sometimes Zoom connections can be a little tenuous, but this has felt really lively and engaged, and I really appreciate your warm welcome.